So whether my screen is visible, I'm audible.
Yes, sir.
Correct. So good morning, students. So welcome to the module 20. Module 20. Today we are going to start about unit 3, that is the diesel engine, right? So in the diesel engine, the first topic we can see what is the constructional features of the diesel engine and how it works, right? So before entering this class, just we can recap what are the terms will be there in the unit 2, right? So for the unit 2, it's a petrol engine, right? So what is the constructional features and what are the working of the petrol engine, that is the SI engine. Then the fuel supply systems, right? So what is the carburization process and what is the carburetor and what about the simple carburetor and the modern carburetor, the differences, right? Then the ignition system, right? So we have battery ignition system, magneto ignition system, and electronic ignition system, right? So that ignition systems and the combustion, right? So what is the combustion and what are the stages are there in the combustion and what is knocking, detonations, right? So these terms and all we discussed in unit 2 about the petrol engine, right? So the same, right? For the same topics which is related to the diesel engine, we are going to see here, right? In the third unit, the same, right? So what is the constructional features of diesel engines and how it is works? Then what about the fuel supply system for the diesel engines? Then what are the combustion stages are there, right? So these terms will be discussing in the unit 3, right? So the diesel engine, right? So the diesel engine is similar to the petrol engine, right? Diesel engine is similar to the petrol engines, which is used in cars, right? So the diesel engine and the petrol engine, so both are the internal combustion engines by means of the burning of the air fuel mixture, the burning of the air fuel mixture within the cylinder, so which is called as the internal combustion engines, right? So both are the reciprocating engines, right? So either diesel engine or a petrol engine, right? Both engines are the reciprocating engines, which is driven by the piston moving laterally in two directions, right? So the majority of the parts are similar, right? Majority of the parts are the similar. So although the diesel engine and the petrol engine operates with the similar components, with the similar components. Just wait. Correct. So the diesel engine and the petrol engine will operate with it operates with the similar components. A diesel engine, when compared to the petrol engine, for the equal horsepower, but it is heavier. The diesel engine will be the heavier due to the stronger, right? Due to the stronger and the heavy materials, which is to withstand the dynamic forces, right? Which withstand the dynamic forces from the high compression pressures which is present in a diesel engine, right? So comparatively we can say the diesel engine is heavier than the petrol engine. Why? Because we are using the heavier materials here, right? So the engine parts will be the heavier materials. Why? Because it has to withstand the greater dynamic forces which is created by the diesel engines due to the high compression ratio, right? So for example, sorry, not an example, for petrol engines, right? What about the compression ratio, right? So the compression ratio of the SI engine, the petrol engines or the gasoline engines will be a 6 to 10, but in diesel engine it's not like that, right? 16 to 24 will be used here, right? For the diesel engine the compression ratio will be high, right? So due to the high pressure, right, due to the high combustion pressure, it will create more dynamic forces, right? That force has to withstand, right? So to withstand the forces, the materials which be made by the engine is very stronger, right? So heavier materials which will be used in a diesel engines, right? Then the greater compression pressure which results the higher compression ratio, right? So I told that what about the petrol engine's compression ratio? Petrol engine's compression ratio will be it's 6 to 10, right? But in the diesel engine it's high, right? But in the diesel engine it's high, so we are using 16 to 24. So most of the time 14 to 24 also we are using as a compression ratio, right? So what is the compression ratio? It is a measure, right, how much of the engine compresses the gases in the engine's cylinder. That is called the compression ratio, right? So then the difference between the SI engine and the diesel engine in the manner of this speed control, right? So in the manner of which is the speed is controlled. So any type of the engine, right, any engine, either petrol engine or diesel engine, the speed is direct function of the amount of the fuel burned, the amount of the fuel burned in the cylinder, right? So for the SI engines or the self speed, the self speed limiting due to the method of the engines which uses the to control the air and fuel entry into the engine, right? So the engine speed is indirectly controlled by the butterfly valves of the carburetor, right? So throttling valves, right? The butterfly valves will be there in the carburetor. So the engine speed is indirectly controlled, right? Indirectly it is controlled, right? uh, but the diesel engine is not like that, right? So the diesel engines are not a self speed limiting engine, right? That you have to note that. So the diesel engines are not self speed limiting, right? Because the air, right? So the oxygen, the air containing the oxygen, the air is entering to the engine is always uh, a maximum amount, right? So um, for the petrol engines we are using the air and fuel mixture will get into the engine cylinder, but here the intake only the air, right? So the maximum amount of air, the maximum amount of oxygen will be sucked into the engine cylinder, right? So therefore the engine speed is limited, the engine speed is limited only by the amount of fuel injected, the amount of fuel injected into the cylinder. So therefore the engine is always has a sufficient amount of oxygen, the engine has always a sufficient amount of the oxygen to burn the uh, combustible, right? So these are called as the fuel injection rate, right? We have to accelerate the fuel injections, right? So that we have to note, right? So in this construction of the diesel engines, the most of the parts are the similar to the uh, SI engine, that is a petrol engine, right? So here you can see what is the difference means, right? So instead of spark plug we are using the fuel injector, right? So then the intake will be here, only the air will be the intake one, right? So for the petrol engines air and fuel will be using, right? Air and fuel mixture will be gets into the intake manifold by using the carburetor the air and fuel will be mixed, and it will be supplied to the engine cylinder. Then here the spark plug will be there, but in the diesel engine it is not like that, right? So here these parts and all the same, right? So these parts and all the same for auto diesel engines and the petrol engines, but only the difference is here instead of the spark plug we are using the fuel injector, right? Instead of spark plug we are using the fuel injector, and here we have some chamber, right? So that chamber is called the pre-chamber. The chamber is called the pre-chamber, and we have some aid, we have some starting aid, right? So glow plug for the starting aid, right? So these three, right, these three are there in the diesel engine construction, right? So the remaining parts and the remaining components are the same, to the petrol engine, right? So here the diesel engine, it does not require, right? The diesel engine does not require the ignition system, right? So why? Because uh, for the petrol engines, we required the ignition, right? We require the ignition system, either it is a battery coil system or um, a magneto coil ignition system, right? But here we didn't require any uh, fuel inject sorry, the ignition system. Why? Because here the fuel will be sprayed through the injection nozzle, right? Here the fuel will be sprayed through the injection nozzle, right? So when the air will be comes into the cylinder, and it is for the suction stroke, and for the compression stroke, it will compresses the air, right? So here it will generate the more pressure, right? So only the air will be the compressed one, right? So the air will get maximum temperature, right? It will get a higher pressure as well as the high temperature, right? So at the high temperature, we have to supply the fuel. We have to spray the fuel from the fuel injector, right? So what will happen? The fuel injector spray the fuels in a small droplets, small fine droplets. So it is a vaporized one. So it will burn by using the compressed air, right? By using the compressed air, right? So once the air will be compressed, it will create a high pressure and the temperature, right? That temperature is enough to burn the fuel droplet, right? So here we are not using any ignition system, right? So here we are not using any ignition system, right? So why? Because the diesel engines, the fuel will be injected into the cylinder through the fuel injector, right? Through the fuel injector, and when the compression, so at the end of the compression stroke, right? At the end of the compression stroke, right? So when the fuel is injected, right? So it will be vaporizes, right? The fuel injector will inject the fuel in a small fine droplets, and it is vaporized, right? Then it is ignited. Then it is ignited due to the heat which is generated in the compression of the air, right? So once the compression of air, what will happen? The pressure will be drastically increases, then the temperature, right? So while increasing the pressure, the temperature also increases, right? So by using that temperature, that heat is enough to ignite the fuel. That heat is enough to burn the fuel inside the cylinder, right? So these are the main one, right? It is the main characteristics of the diesel engine, right? Then you already know that the working system, right? So uh, again, you have to see the working system, or we can switch over to the other topic. Anyone? Anyone?
Next topic, sir.
Next topic, right? Okay. So the fuel supply system for the CI engines, right? So in the SI engine, we are using the fuel system. We have to mix the air and fuel before entering to the cylinder. We have to mix the air and fuel, right? So we are using the device, the carburetor, right? But in a CI engines, the intake is only the air, right? In the CI engine, the intake is only the air. So here we didn't require, right? We don't require any ignition system, right? So in the CI engines, right? The CI engines, only the air is taken into the cylinder during the suction stroke, right? Only the air is taken into the cylinder during the suction stroke, and it is compressed to the high pressure, right? So here you can see the pressure ranges will be 28 to 70 bar pressure, right? And it will generate the high temperature, that is the 520 degrees Celsius temperature to the 720 degree temperature it will generate, right? So here in the CI engine, the diesel engine, the compression ratio is high, right? So here the compression ratio will be 12 is to 1 to 20 is to 1, right? So due to the high temperature, right? Due to this high temperature, so the this temperature is enough to ignite this temperature is enough to ignite the fuel supply from the fuel injector, right? So then we can see what is the fuel injector and how it will works, right? So the fuel is injected into the cylinder at the end of the compression stroke. At the end of the compression stroke, uh, so the fuel will be sprayed in a particular pressure, right? The pressure ranges will be 100 bar to 200 bar, right? The fuel will be sprayed in a fuel injector, right? So through the fuel injector, it will be sprayed at the pressure of 100 to 200 bar, right? So during this process of the injection of the fuel is broken into a very small fine droplet, right? Right. So the fuel will be injected through the injector, right? The injector will injects the fuel at at the pressure of the 100 to 200 bar, right? Then the fuel will be comes out in a small sprays, right? So small fine droplets, right? So that droplets will be vaporizers, right? That droplet will be vaporizers, right? That drop will be vaporizers, and that drops will take the heat from the compression stroke of the air, right? So here we can get a temperature of 520 to 720 degrees Celsius, right? So that temperature, that heat will be taken from the droplets, right? That heat will be taken from, taken in the droplet, and it will be ignites, and the droplets will be starts to ignite, right? So that process is called, right? So that process is called the burning of the fuel, the burning of the fuel in the fuel supply system of the CI engines, right? So here uh, the oxygen content, right? Uh, Here only the supply of the intake is only the pure air, right? So the air will have the more sufficient amount of the oxygens, right? So more sufficient of the oxygen. So the amount of oxygen is always available to burn the fuel, right? To burn the fuel. So the burning reduces, right? So the burning will be reduces, and therefore the heat released is also released, right? So heat release also a reduced one, right? Then uh, in the SI engine, we noted that what is the ignition lag? Anyone? What is ignition lag? Anyone? Ignition lag in SI engines. Ignition lag. Anyone? Selva Vinayagam. What is ignition lag?
Sir, fuel flow is low, sir.
என்னப்பா?
Fuel வந்துட்டு இக்னிஷனுக்கு போறப்போ லோவா இருந்ததுன்னா அப்புறம்
ஸோ எஸ்ஐ என்ஜினில் பார்த்தீங்க அப்படின்னா இந்த ஃபியூவல் கரெக்டாக இந்த ஃபியூவல் வந்து ஸ்பார்க் எப்போ ப்ரொடியூஸ் ஆகுதோ ஸ்பார்க் ப்ரொடியூஸ் ஆகக்கூடிய டைம்ல இருந்து அந்த ஸ்பார்க்கு எப்போ நம்மளுக்கு வந்து ஃபியூலுக்கு ரீச் ஆகுது, எப்போ நம்மளுக்கு ஃபியூல் வந்து பேர்ன் பண்ண ஸ்டார்ட் ஆகுது, ரைட்டா? அந்த டைம் பீரியட் தான் சொல்லியிருப்போம் இக்னிஷன் லேக் அப்படின்னு சொல்லுவோம், கரெக்டா? அந்த டைம் பீரியட் தான் சொல்லியிருப்போம் இக்னிஷன் லேக், ரைட்? ஸோ at the same for the same here we are using the ignition delay, கரெக்டா? இங்க நம்ம என்ன பண்ணியிருக்கோம், we are using as the term the ignition delay, right? So the time between the start of the injection of the fuel, the start of the injection fuel, and it is start to ignite, and it is start to ignition, right? So this time gap is called as the ignition delay, right? So the fuel injector will press the fuel, right? So when start of the injection, when start of the injection and when start of the ignition, right? So the time gap between these two is called the ignition delay, right? So here for the high speed engines, it will be 0.001 second. For the low speed engines, it will be 0.002 seconds, right? And the ignition delay will have some crank rotation also. That crank rotation will be at 25 degree of the crank rotation, 25 degree of the crank rotation, right? So it's a one of important two mark, right? What is the ignition delay, right? So the time period, right? The period between the start of the injection and the start of the ignition, right? So the time gap between these two is called the ignition delay, right? So the ignition delay will affect the engine performance in direct manner, right? So if the ignition delay is somewhat less, the engine performance will be good. See, so the lesser ignition delay period, it gives the better engine performance. Right? So the lesser ignition delay period is directly affects the engine performance, right? So it will give the good ignition performance, right? Then the requirements, right? What are the requirements are there, right? So what are the major or what are the important requirements are there in the injection system, right? So here the injection system, it's a very important one, right? Why? Because we have to supply the fuel to the injection through the injector, right? So the amount of the fuel injector is very important one, right? So the metering, right? The accurate metering is very important one for the injection system, right? So why? Because uh, if in the carburetor, right, if in the SI, that is the petrol engine, what will happen? The amount of fuel supply, right, depending upon the throttle and depending upon the working condition and for the other criteria, right? So the fuel will be mixed with the air in a carburetor, right? That process is called the carburization, right? But here for every cycle we have to inject the fuel in a small amount, very small amount of fuel will be injected through the injector, right? So the amount of fuel injected has to measure in a proper manner, right? So that is very critical one, right? That is very critical one. See, it's a very critical one, right? Why? Because we have to measure a very small quantity of the fuel will be injected, right? So that has to be a very accurate one. So the accurate metering is very important one, right? So the accurate metering is very important one, right? So depending upon the load and the engine condition, surely the fuel supply will be varies, right? Purely that the fuel supply will be varies depending upon the various loads and the engine speed, right? So various loads and engine speed we have to supply the different amount of the fuel. So the accurate metering system is very important in a injection system, right? Then the second one is the timing of the injection, right? When we have to spray the fuel, right? So at the end of the compression stroke, we have to supply the fuel, right? So the timing of the injection is very important, right? So if the timing will be missing means surely it will get some abnormal burning, right? So for the clear burning and for the economic of the fuel the timing of the injection is very important one, right? Timing of the injection is very important one, and the proper control of the rate of the injection, right? Same the first point, right? So the metering is very important one, right? So the proper control of the fuel will be injected, right? So that's very important one. And here we have some pattern of the sprays, right? So how the pattern will be there, how the pattern will be there for burning, right? That we have to see, right? Then the proper atomization, right? What is atomization here? The proper atomization of the fuel is very important one. Why? Because so the fuel will be injected in a small fine droplets, right? That fine droplets will be gets to vaporizes, right? So that process is called the atomization, right? We have to create a fine droplet, right? We have to create a fine droplet of fuel that will be injected through the injector, right? So we have to create a fine droplet, that is called the atomization. That process is called the atomization process, right? That's also a important one. Then the spray pattern, right? So the spray pattern is very important one. Why? Because the spray pattern will affect the burning, right? So if the spray pattern is good, right, so we can get a normal burning, right? Otherwise we can get abnormal burning, right? So we have to ensure that the spray pattern will be good for the rapid mixing of the fuel and air in a cylinder of the engine. Then the uniform distribution of the fuel droplets, right? So whether the fuel droplets will be uniformly distributed or not in the combustion chamber, that we have to see, right? So then the supply of the equal quantity of the metering fuel, right? That's same the first point, right? So the accurate metering is very required, right? So for the multi-cylinder engines, the same amount of the fuel will be injected in all the cylinders or not, right? That we have to see, right? So for the multi-cylinder engines, then I already told that the ignition delay, right? So the ignition delay will be lesser, means the engine performance will be good, right? So the delay we have to see the lag, right? So no lag during the beginning and the end of the injection, right? Either the start of the injection and the end of the injection, we have to eliminate some dripping of the fuel droplets, right? So dripping of the fuel droplet has to uh, what is dripping? Anyone? Dripping. Dripping என்னப்பா ஞாபகம் இருக்கா? எப்படின்னு என்ன தெரியுமா? ஸோ ஒரு டேப்ல இருந்து பார்த்தோன்னா வந்து நம்ம ஃபைனாக வந்து நம்ம வந்து ஸ்ப்ரே பண்ணிட்டு இருக்கோம், ரைட்டா? ஸோ ஸ்ப்ரே பண்ணிட்டு முடிச்சிட்டோம், அந்த ஃபியூல் வந்து கட் ஆஃப் பண்ணிட்டோம். அப்போ என்ன ஆகும்னா வந்து சம் பெரிய ட்ராப்ல வந்துட்டு என்ன ஆகும், அந்த நாசரோட டிப்ல இருந்து மேபி ட்ராப் ஆகிறதுக்கான சான்சஸ் இருக்கு, ரைட்டா? அட் த எண்ட் ஆஃப் த இக்னிஷன் இன்ஜெக்ஷன் ஆர் அட் த பிகினிங் ஆஃப் த இன்ஜெக்ஷன், ரைட்டா? ஸோ அந்த இடத்துல என்ன ஆகும்னா நமக்கு வந்து ஒரு பெரிய ஒரு ட்ராப்லெட் வந்து அந்த இடத்துல அப்படியே இருந்துகிட்டே ஹோல்ட் ஆகிட்டே இருந்துகிட்டே இருக்கும், ரைட்டா? ஸோ அந்த மாதிரியான ட்ராப்லெட் பேர் தான் சொல்லிப்போம் ட்ரிப்ளிங், ரைட்டா? ட்ரிப்ளிங் ஆஃப் ஃபியூவல் droplets அப்படின்னு சொல்லியிருப்போம், ரைட்டா? இது வரைக்கும் சொன்னது கிளியரா இருப்பா? இது வரைக்கும் சொன்னது கிளியரா? Anyone?
Yes, sir.
Okay, right. Fine. So next, the classifications, right? So classification of the injection system, right? For the classification of the injection system, right? So in the diesel engine, it is a constant pressure cycle, right? So diesel engine is a constant pressure cycle. So only the air is compressed into the cylinder, and then the fuel is injected into the cylinder by means of the fuel injection system, right? So for producing the required pressure for the atomizing the fuel, right, either the air or a mechanical means, right? So the air injection system will be there and the solid injection system also there, right? So according the injection system will be classified, right? So as the two terms, right? One is the air injection system and one more is the solid injection system, right? So in the air injection system, right, in the air injection system, the fuel is forced into the cylinder by means of the compressed air, right? The compressed air, right? The fuel is forced into the cylinder by means of the compressed air. So this system, right, this system is used nowadays in little manner, right? So because it requires the bulky multi-stage of air compressor, right? It requires the bulky multi-stage air compressor, right? So this causes the increase in engine weight and it reduces the brake power output, and it reduces the brake power output. And the advantage that climbed in the air injection system is the good mixing of the air and fuel, right? The good mixing of the fuel with the air. So it will get results in a higher mean effective pressure, right? It will get the higher mean effective pressure, and it is having the ability, right? It is having the ability to utilize the fuel of the high velocity or high viscosity, right? So high viscosity fuels, right? So it can utilize the high viscosity fuels, right? So which are the less expansive, right? Less expansive than which is the other terms, right, which is used in the engines of the solid ignition, solid injection systems, right? So the advantages of this air injection system is requirement of the multi-stage air compressor, right? So therefore thereby the making of the air injection system is used in a nowadays in the engines, right? But in the solid ignition systems, right? So in the solid ignition systems, the fuel is injected directly into the combustion chamber. The fuel is injected directly into the combustion chamber without the aid of the compressed air, without the aid of the compressed air, right? So hence the airless the mechanical injection or a solid injection, right? It is called the solid injection system, right? So in this diagram you can see, right? So here we add some glow plug, right? So for the air, right, for the air ignition system, right, for the air ignition system, right, so we are using the glow plug, right? So without the glow plug also the ignition system will be, the injection system will be there, right? So the fuel injector supplies the fuel directly to the pre-chamber and the combustion chamber, right? So without this term, without this aid, right? So this type of system is called the solid injection. That type of system is called solid injection, right? So if we are using the glow pump means it is called the air injection system, right? So the fuel, the supplied fuel will be uh, compressed well by using the air, right, which is supplied through the glow plug, right? By supplied through the glow plug, right? So these are the two systems, right? So one is the air injection system and one more is the solid injection system. These are the difference, right? So here we are not using any starting add, right? So in the solid injection system, right? So in that solid injection system we have uh, again four sub classifications, right? So individual pump and nozzle system, the unit injector system, common rail system, and the distributor system, right? So we have four subdivision of the solid injection system, right? So before going to see this classification, just we can see what is the fuel fit system, right? So how the fuel feed will be there and what are the components are there, right? uh, okay, right, we can stop here in this class, right? We can see this term in the next class. So already the time will be 9:12 now, right? So do you have any doubt in this class?